Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to Unsiloed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Hatim Rahman, who is at Northwestern's Kellogg School of Management, and also the author of this book called Inside the Invisible Cage: How Algorithms Control Workers. Welcome, Hatim.
Thank you so much for having me here. I'm excited to talk to you.
Well, this book's about a lot of things. I mean, narrowly, it's about an extended case study, right, of a anonymized company that's in the business of matching employers with skilled, I guess we'd call them gig workers. And you use this in-depth study to look at the impact that these algorithms have, particularly on the workers themselves. But I think it's more than just about the workforce. I mean, a lot of the insights that you draw from this data could be applied to virtually any kind of platform, right? Whether it be eBay or Uber or even like Tinder,
Sure.
Because it's really about the opacity, right? And the way in which the algorithms shape our behavior and the difficulty that we have in sort of reverse engineering or figuring out what exactly the algorithms want us to do. So maybe I thought I would start off, the title of the book was inspired by Max Weber. And it comes out of, I guess, I didn't realize there was an entire literature called like control theory. Is that it? It's in sociology. So maybe you could start by telling us a bit about, where the title comes from and this idea of the iron cage and what Max Weber was talking about when he talked about the kind of bureaucratization of work in large companies.
It's a great question because, Max Weber is one of the most influential, not just sociologists, but social science scholars. In he has many observations that have been very influential, but one of them is about the relationship between managers and workers. And historically, the way that managers overlooked workers was literally by trying to watch and monitor and supervise them, the foreman looking over their workers. And what he found was that, especially, after World War I, World War II, the economy moved towards what is called bureaucracies, where organizations, instead of relying on managers to oversee everything that you're doing, they created these kind of rational rules and procedures for what you should be doing and how to advance in your careers. So show up on time, do well in your performance evaluations. Those are very clearly outlined expectations and rules for what you should and shouldn't do and what should lead to career progression. And so although it was in German is a different word, was translated, the word he used to describe this as an iron cage, because there's nothing, technically, making you stay in an organization, but the rules and procedures are very rational. They make sense. And so it kind of encages you and closes you in to being loyal and working for an organization. And maybe the more direct example of this is many people now are aware of Silicon Valley and how they give many employees these perks of like on-site massages, free lunch, free dinner, dental care. And one way is like, wow, they're providing all these benefits. The other, from the Weber iron cage angle, is that these are all mechanisms to keep employees loyal to work and keep them there.
Yes.
And so, but to take a step back, the idea behind the iron cage is that the way to succeed, the way that organizations controlled you was through very rational, transparent rules and procedures. And as you alluded to, what I'm trying to advance in this book is that the way we should understand how organizations, particularly digital platforms like eBay, Amazon, Upwork, Fiverr, so on and so forth, Netflix, what they've done, especially as they operate on scale, which we can get to, is that they've embraced algorithms to control our opportunities, how we're evaluated, what we like, what we see, so on and so forth. And that those algorithms over time have become more opaque and dynamic, such that they more or less are akin to an invisible cage. They're still controlling our our opportunities, our success, but the inputs to the rules, how they're processed in their outputs are opaque to especially workers or those who are subject to these algorithms.
Well, it seems like, I mean, the motivation behind the bureaucratization is twofold. I mean, one is to try to eliminate some of the discretion, right, that individual managers might have, right? So,
Yeah.
these rules are subject to review and presumably can be, improved over time and redesigned to attain the objective of the firm. But there's
Yeah.
also there's an element of, I guess, legitimization, right? So, no one wants to have somebody standing over them in a domineering position.
Yeah.
But if
Yeah.
you have this sense that there's some procedural justice or some, collective purpose that's being satisfied through the implementation of these rules, then you're much more likely to participate in the workforce, right?
Yeah, no, so that's a really, again, very astute observation and question comment that for bureaucracies, one of the key underlying assumptions or factors that I talk about is that you had a very stable employment relationship, or what sometimes people call full-time employee, where in return for following these rational procedures and policies, you would get benefits, you would get sick time off, vacation days, and again, a career ladder. Now, it makes sense when you want to keep your employees loyal, or also when you desire standardization, right? You want everyone to behave and act in a similar fashion and manner,
You want
which is
predictability,
what,
right?
yes, exactly, in a predictable manner and fashion. And that you actually do see that on some in other situations settings that are using algorithms, like on Uber and Lyft and more routine service work. The algorithms there are transparent and they are very, so it's kind of continuation in those situation settings. Now the settings that I'm talking about, like in the digital platforms where there's like millions or maybe billions of products or people or services, the platforms or these organizations, they actually want differentiation. They don't want everyone, no, they don't say they don't want, but there's this understanding that not everyone has the same level of skills, or within the genre of movies or within a particular product, there is some differentiation that's needed based on preferences, based on circumstance, based on the project needs. And one of the things that that happened, I'm going to get into this now because I think it's relevant, is that starting from eBay, all of these digital platforms in many organizations, they used to use a transparent rating, right? Where you could clearly see, okay, 5 stars on timeliness, 5 stars on communication. But the problem is on these platforms that want differentiation, when you make the criteria transparent, it leads to what we call gaming behavior, where you start to do anything necessary to get the best rating, even though it may not reflect what actually happened. And again, and maybe that's a little abstract, very hopefully concretely or or a lot of people have experienced, when you go on Amazon, many people report that the ratings of the products that are there don't really reflect their actual experience, right? You can get these junk products, you can get these products that break down. I would in case you're like, type in a very like a common good, like a lamp or like a bike light. You start to see all these products that look exactly the same and all have 5-star ratings. Well, that's not very useful now for making a decision, right? Because you would ideally like to see, which one is the best battery length, which one is the brightest light, so on and so forth. But when everyone has the same rating, it's no longer very useful for algorithms or the people who are trying to use that information to make a decision.
Well, you're talking about two things at once. I mean, one is the move from these sort of longer term relationships between
Hmm.
employer and employee, or between buyer and seller, or lender and borrower, with these more kind of spot market transactions, right? Where
Yeah.
you're buying from anonymous suppliers, or of labor, or you're buying
Yeah.
some gadget on Amazon, you have no idea who the seller is, you're buying it on eBay.
Yeah.
Right, there's that. But then there's also this move towards the use of algorithms. But I mean, those are separate, because even in the full-time employment relationship, we're seeing the adoption of these algorithms, right? So,
Yeah.
Google, for instance, I mean, they'll use algorithms to, evaluate employee input and productivity, and then, for promotion and so forth and so on. And so,
Correct.
being able to have a heterogeneous incentives and heterogeneous jobs, like you're starting to see that even in the big corporations, right?
Yeah, so you're right. Those are two elements. One is the nature of employment relationship, and second is kind of the nature of the technology or the goal that they're using for. So there are 2 points. So right, I mean, I think when I started studying this in 2014-ish, at that time it was primarily in what's called the gig economy, when we saw the kind of this proliferation on a global scale of the idea that anyone can be a 1099 gig worker, where they no longer need a full-time employment relationship. So that's kind of the impetus, and where I think a lot of the ideas in my studies come from. But you're absolutely correct that many large or organizations more generally have adopted this opacity too. So recently in these tech layoffs that have occurred, employees have reported that the criteria that was being used to make these decisions was opaque. Was using some sort of algorithm that wasn't revealed to the workers, right? And some speculated it was like how many lines of code they were generating, or other things like that. But no one, the organization didn't publicly come out and say anything, and it was much harder to decipher. I will say one more thing though. The reason why going back to the employment relationship is very important is that even in the case that we're talking about, like, these tech companies, full-time employees, generally speaking, have 100 years of labor law that they can use to seek recourse. So what do I mean by that? When people are laid off, if they feel like they're laid off unjustly, there is an entire legal establishment set up that allows them to, file lawsuits, compel them to release information and data about the employee they collected. Now, on these gig platforms, we're not there yet. We're not even close to having the same level of legal protections, lawsuits, laws that these workers can use for several reasons. One is relatively newer compared to full-time employment and bureaucracies. And second, these platforms operate on a global scale. And so the laws that pass in the European Union, they usually don't apply to workers in the US, Canada, so on and so forth.
But of course, I mean, even if you're working on site, if you're a contract worker, you don't have those rights, right? So
Yeah.
So you're talking about like the move from permanent work to part-time work, and then also, right, the move from these on-site, in-person relationships to these sort of digital, remote, anonymous relationships.
You're 100% correct that many organizations for decades now have more contract employees than full-time employees.
Yeah, I think
either on-site or
Facebook probably has more, second-class workers than first-class workers at any given time, right?
Yeah, even on-site. Many of them work on-site, many of them work remote. A large mix of them, right? And I know, I mean, it's just topical right now, but I saw somebody post a scholar post. I didn't have a chance to verify, but they said, like, in the U.S., the number of federal employees has actually remained very stable, similar, but the number of contract employees has increased a lot over the years. So it's interesting. It's not just in the private sector, but even in the public sector, there's been this huge increase in contract workers who are increasingly at hazard, subject to these opaque algorithms without the same level of recourse or legal pathways to compel transparency.
Now, look, just because we have algorithms deciding things, they don't need to be opaque. I mean, we have transparent algorithms. I mean, you have a small bit in the book where you talk about credit scores, and I mean, credit scores or FICO scores, those are actually very, very transparent, right? Like, you want to know why I got a low credit score. They say, well, because, you have this percentage of your debt and so forth and so on. And so it's possible to have transparent ones. And I guess the big mystery is, wouldn't it be in the interest of an employer to be as transparent as possible, right? If you're trying to get your workers to do stuff, you got to tell them what you want. I mean, it's kind of like at the end of every semester, you're in a business school like me.
Yeah.
You get these student evaluations, and sometimes you'll have someone just give you like a one,
Right.
with no comment, and you're like,
Right.
what am I supposed to do with this? Right? Like, don't give me this. Tell me what's going on here. Otherwise, it's just a useless thing, right? So I guess, I mean, I love the part about Goodhart's law. Obviously, we don't want to have complete transparency, but certainly it should be in the interest of the platform, if you're trying to get good quality workers, to kind of tell them what it means to be a good quality worker.
So that's an excellent point. And this is something I kind of wrestle with at the end of the book, that it's crucial to try to find the right balance between transparency and opacity. How do you strike the right balance? And honestly, organizations and digital platforms, they want to find the right balance, but they just struggled a lot to do so. And because many employers are risk averse and want to limit their liability, I mean, I don't know, but I imagine that this is one of the reasons why they have favored opacity, right? If we don't have to reveal or tell, then it limits our ability to get, exposure to lawsuits or exposure to gaming, so on and so forth. So, I can't tell you, why specifically they haven't. All I do know from conversations with people is that they are trying to figure out, and to some extent, it's wax and wane, right? So I kind of document in the book how it started very transparent, and the reaction was like, oh, let's just make it very opaque, because people will kind of just behave like themselves. But it turns out that, again, we are very influenced by our ratings, how we are evaluated, and if you don't tell people, people will try to guess. They'll come up with theories, and that's not productive. As I very much document in the book, it creates a lot of anxiety, creates a lot of lost loyalty, desires to exit. And so you're right that you would want to find the optimal level, but doing so in practice is really, really hard. And sometimes people say what's the right answer? And I propose one in the book, but I also say if we can figure that out, there's a lot of money to be made, YouTube, so on and so forth. They've been dealing with this problem for social media, people who buy influence, who buy likes, who buy watches, who buy views, excuse me. They really are trying to protect against it.
I mean, one of the things that I was thinking as I was reading this book is that the eponymous company, Talent Finder, I mean, it sounds like they needed a research arm. You know what I mean? Don't a lot of these companies have research arms that do. I mean, you talk about how they do all this experimentation, but it's unclear, whether their experimental protocols are any good, right? I don't understand whether they're getting the results that they want. Unless we know what the algorithm is, we don't really know if they're getting what they want, right?
So let me answer this. So they are doing lots of experimentation, but it's optimizing for imbalanced, or if I want to be more direct, the wrong outcomes, right? For many years, platforms across the ecosystem, organizations across the ecosystem, have been optimizing for growth and engagement.
Yeah.
And all the experimentation, I shouldn't say all, but the majority is geared towards those outcomes.
So because the markets are valuing that as opposed to profitability or some other metric.
Well, or user satisfaction, right? Those types of things, right? And let me to emphasize this again. We've seen these on the labor platform that I studied, but also think about social media, right? A huge problem and issue that has been now well documented in various research is that they were optimizing for engagement. And what does that do? It's like, it puts people, like, if you follow it to its logical conclusion, you're going to be watching things that you like and more extreme versions of things that you like or dislike. And that ends up in a very narrow, this is what people call echo chambers or filter bubbles, in a very narrow space. And so again, yes, I think, from the outside hindsight, so yeah, like, why don't they just optimize for different outcomes? But it's hard to, overemphasize how this was widespread across several different types of industries, that there wasn't many questions being asked about, we need to be optimizing for growth, engagement, and it led to these suboptimal outcomes overall in the long run, right?
Yeah.
Not just for the platforms, but for people, for society. And so it's just the argument I make is that what they prioritized and valued wasn't aligned with, I think, the most win-win or optimal outcomes.
Yeah, because you'd think that from a platform's perspective, particularly one that has market power like they do, you'd think that their first goal would be to maximize the pie, right? The amount of value creation. And then, try to make sure that they get a big chunk of that. But it seems like the more value they create, and the more transactions they create, and the more business they generate by recruiting more workers and more clients, then the more money they can make. And if they're scaring people off because they're creating anxiety, or if they're mismatching or whatever, that's going to somehow reduce the pie.
Well, that's assuming that they're alternatives, right? Credible alternatives that are out there. And so in the context that I studied, and again, in almost all these different sectors, there's usually a very major player. And let me hopefully give you an accessible example. If you ask book publishers and authors, they have disliked Amazon's terms, policies, and power for a very, very long time. I can remember back to the early 2000s, even, it's like book publishers were trying to like protest and withdraw their books. But it turns out that when you have a very large dominant platform and the customers are all use that platform, well, people feel there's no other choice but to use that and continue to do so, even though they don't like the terms, they don't like the experience, they don't like the practices that organization or platform is doing. And we're seeing that in several examples. Now, on the other hand, when you do have credible competition or alternatives, you do see now differences that are there, right? So again, I'm not, a lot of literature shows that things aren't necessarily better with Uber and Lyft, but they're better than they were when it was just Uber. You know what I'm saying? Because there's research that talks about how Lyft tried to be more friendly towards drivers, hold meetups for them, be more responsive to them, and so you're right that if there was one or more alternatives that were better for workers, for clients, we would see people leave, or branch out or try different alternatives.
Now, what I like about the studies, you go way back to the very beginning. So you kind of tell a story about how these guys they're kind of fumbling around and they're kind of figuring things out as they go. And originally it was like a staffing agency, and then it became, and if it is the company that I think it is, I know some of these folks, right? But it started out as a staffing agency, and then became this platform. And once you become a platform, then you kind of allow anybody in there, right? So anybody can join, just like anybody can throw up a website that gets picked up by Google's PageRank, and just about anybody who's selling something can go on Amazon. We've all bought things from Amazon that don't work. Like I bought little, headphone jacks that had 5-star ratings that turned out to be total garbage. And so this the idea of rating is how eBay, and they pioneered it, got over this trust problem. And so, you can't do away with ratings. You need ratings, or you need some kind of ranking that funnels buyers to sellers, right?
Well, okay. So this is a great point. And I actually want to touch upon a hypothesis that I have. I'm sure there's academic work that has done it. It's just not, I'm not aware of it. But on product platforms like eBay and Amazon that are more spot transactions, I do think initially ratings helped. when they were accurate. But as soon as they became gamed and everyone started to like get high ratings, I actually think the reason why Amazon and eBay and so on and so forth do well is not because of the ratings anymore. It's because of the ability for customers to return the product. That's what gives people now the confidence to be able to buy and sell at scale, because they know, like, man, these ratings, they're going to try their best, but yeah, you never know. And so because I can return relatively easily, I can do it. So I want to clarify, I'd be interested,
Yeah.
and I'm sure there's work out there,
But
but
you
it's
can't
really
do that, you
interesting.
can't do that with labor, right? That's the problem, right? The problem is
Exactly.
that, if you get a babysitter, let's say, I remember there used to be that babysitter platform, and they come over and they do a terrible job with your kids. I mean,
Right.
you can't just, return them, right?
Yeah.
Go back to status quo ante.
Or Airbnb, right? You show up to your host's place and it's trash, or you can't get in. What are you going to do, right?
Mhm.
And so, yeah, I mean, the theory is very simple. Ratings should solve this, right? If you do a bad job of hiring or working or giving your place is inaccessible or you're not responsive, I give you negative ratings. The issue is with these platforms is that they are just intermediaries, right? And so there's always this direct conversation that the people they're connecting, the host and the guest, the worker and the client, who can be like, look, yeah, I know you had a bad experience, but instead of giving a negative rating, let me refund you.
Yeah.
Or let me extend your stay.
Right.
Yeah, I don't care. That's fine. I'll gladly do that.
So that's ratings inflation. So ratings inflation becomes a big. I mean, I'm on Uber, and there's a lot of things I don't like about some of my Uber drivers. Like, a lot of them will play music without asking me. Sometimes the car will smell like smoke and dogs and whatever. But I never give anybody less than a 5, because I don't want. It's a pain in the butt, and I don't want to get these guys fired. So, I mean, is ratings inflation just inevitable in these platforms?
I mean, empirically, it has been inevitable, especially when, these dynamics occur, right? When it's very transparent. So again, on my platform setting, the way they try to address it, they say, okay, we'll leave the public rating. We'll allow you to do that, but we're going to try to collect private ratings as well. And that the way they tried to implement it and roll it out was like, we're not going to share it. It's just for us, more or less. And so right. I do think, going back to what you referenced earlier, Goodhart's law, when a measure essentially becomes a target, it ceases to be reliable, right? Meaning that, like, when you're trying to perform for to get a good grade or to do well, it's no longer about what you're actually trying to measure or assess. Then yeah, you're going to face this problem. And again, as you mentioned, as instructors, we face this issue as well, right? Like, what is the grade actually capturing? And so long as we are in the current dynamic of intermediary, contract employment, arm's length distance, I do foresee these problems persisting, even though they make these adjustments. Again, people are very adept at resisting or finding loopholes.
Yeah, I mean, when you're very transparent about what you're using as a proxy, because ultimately all of these scores or evaluations are proxies for something else, right? Like, when you give a grade to somebody, it's a proxy for, they know the material, right?
Yeah.
And it's usually some kind of subset of the thing that you're looking for. So if you make it clear, like, this is how you're graded, then everybody's going to go after that. And of course,
Right.
Google's had this problem where if they explain how PageRank works, then you just buy some SEO and rise to the top. Even in the credit scores with FICO, I mean, one of the problems with FICO is that it is transparent. And so you can hire a credit doctor, and a lot of people did this in 2007, right? 2006,
Yeah.
got mortgages that they shouldn't have gotten. And, if you're doing, I remember I had some friends who started a workplace analytics company, and they were doing, recruiting, and they determined that the browser that you use to log on to the website was a predictor of work quality, right? A predictor, right? And not a cause, but a predictor.
Right.
And, they ultimately went up publishing this research in number of places. But if you put that on the application, like, hey, the employer is going to love you a whole lot more if you use
Yeah,
Firefox, then it ceases to be a valuable signal, because the only reason why it's
exactly.
a signal is because it's
Yeah,
capturing something else, right?
yeah,
So I mean, is there? I mean, obviously, full transparency is not
yeah,
good, unless it was so fine grained that it couldn't be gamed.
yeah. Well, okay. On the last point, we people are trying to do this, but essentially get to this big brother thing, then, right? Like,
Right.
you very quickly get to, like, okay, we're going to surveil everything. Like, I don't know if you saw this. I included this in my. I'm going to start teaching soon again. Microsoft apparently rolled out in one of their operating system updates, like, will continuously take screenshots of your
Yeah.
screen. Who wants to sign up for that? Yeah, it can get very fine grained, but I don't want to sign up for that.
Yeah.
Um, but for many reasons, right? And it's not a good proxy. But what we're kind of getting at, depending on the transaction or what's going on, especially as it relates to hiring, it turns out, due diligence is important. What we learn about, give a prototype or do a trial run, similar, like, what are internships besides a trial run for both sides, right? Um, because, like, even if you have a PhD from Stanford or an MBA from Harvard, we know, or an MBA from Wharton, for example, right? We know that sends a signal, but you shouldn't use that as the only signal to make a decision on whether you want to bring them into your company, whether you want to marry someone, right? So on and so forth, right? So I think what we're getting at is that for the early part of the internet, maybe even 20 years, we were conditioned to think that what we see online is generally reliable. We have and continue to rapidly going to an environment where we're rewiring or re-socializing ourselves to think, like, no, those ratings are interesting, or what I'm seeing on my news feed is there, but we need to interrogate it depending on the context, right? Like, again, whether right now, whether my browser is experimenting with the color of my URL bar, and that doesn't, for me personally, it doesn't influence my day to day that much. But if you're going to start to experiment with my credit score, or if I'm going to, things that are consequential and that's going to vary by the individual, the situation, the organization, as soon as that becomes the case, due diligence is very important. And that can be done through multiple factors, as we said, depending on the context. And again, product markets have figured out the due diligence is easy returns, right? In these other contexts, like labor, for example, I think some sort of mechanism that allows people to, yes, do an interview, and maybe even like a portion of a project that's paid, so that people can get compensated for their work, but that allows you to get a sense for, would I actually want to work with them? Are they best suited for my project? Now, what I'm saying essentially is adding some friction to the process is useful.
Well, I mean, I think that someone could misinterpret your work as nostalgia for the non-digital workplace, and I don't think that. I think that would be unfair, because, look, all of the problems that you highlight here, I mean, they appear in the non-digital workforce. I mean, we all know non-digital workplaces that have opaque promotion criteria. I mean, I've been in places where I'm like, wait, why am I not? Why have I just been kicked out of this whole deal? And then I ask some of my coworkers, like, oh, because you didn't kiss the boss's ass, right? And it's like, oh, well, where is that in the employment documents? Like, I didn't see that anywhere. And but some people figure it out and other people don't. I mean, there are clearly workplace situations everywhere with opaque rules and lack of procedural justice and no way to appeal and so forth, right? So, I mean, aren't there cases where the use of these algorithms are actually resulting in better, more accurate assessments, and kind of opening the door to people who wouldn't otherwise get access in the more
Yeah.
mainstream labor markets?
Yeah. No. So I think you touched upon a couple of very important points. One is that, yes, in organizations there's opacity. There are elements of the invisible cage in every organization. Now, broadly speaking, within traditional organizations, you become socialized, or you figure out what those opacity, not all the time, but as you said, like, you figure out, like, okay, which boss do I need to be nice to,
Mhm.
because you have all, experienced people who will tell
Well,
you, or you'll observe it.
but the chat rooms that you studied sort of perform that function, don't they?
They do, but however, with the one point I make is the speed and scale of algorithms allows you to change them in a way that people cannot, or it's very difficult to keep up with. And so one of the things that in a different paper we cite, like Uber, for, I don't know, I haven't checked recently, but as of last year, or a year and a half ago, they would publicly post at any one time, they're running 1,000 experiments on the platform. An individual cannot keep up with that, right? Because again, algorithms allow for this unprecedented speed and scale. So, so that's one point, that yes, it is. And what I mentioned earlier, that in these other organizations, there are ways to seek recourse when you run into these situations. Sorry, one second. And so there are ways for recourse for these for traditional employees in these situations. Now, you are right that I'm not calling or arguing for going back to the time, because these platforms have enabled workers to get access to opportunities that they've never had an opportunity, right, in their local labor market. So I remember talking to a reporter early on that, like, Ukrainians who were displaced from the war, they were able to keep working in a way that used to be impossible on these online labor markets. You can work for Microsoft or Google, right, theoretically. And so, yeah, algorithms do enable that. So it's not an either or. It's kind of like a yes and. Yes, it does. And now we need to figure out ways to make sure it doesn't slide into a Big Brother dystopian or any of those other negative outcomes. So trying to figure out better optimal ways to avoid those situations and preserve the benefits that drew people to these platforms in the first place.
Yeah, I'm wondering if market power should determine the extent to which these platforms should have duties to their members, right? So, whether it's appeals processes, whether it's informed consent about experimentation, whether it's transparency, because if it's easy to exit and there are like a dozen of them and you just kind of can't figure it out, you don't like it, then you just move. But to the extent that there are these switching costs, it seems like, and to the extent that they're monopolies, more or less, these are winner take all platforms, then it gives rise to certain duties that wouldn't otherwise be there. I mean, do you think that's one way we could kind of think about this?
Well, yeah,
sort
I
of
mean,
antitrust lens, I guess, is how we would think about it.
yeah, I mean, this is again a very emerging area and important for research, right? That I think one thing that's clear is that these organizations and platforms, they have a very difficult time figuring out the right balance on their own, right? And again, we've seen this across the context. At the same time, regulation does help, right? So going back to the example we started with, credit scores, FICO, that came out because of regulation, right? And I believe in the 70s, regulators say, hey, like, in order to reduce the opacity and give people more transparency and accountability, we need to implement these credit, credit kind of reporting and rights for people to understand their scores. And so, yeah, I do think that finding the right amount of balance between self-regulation, where organizations can figure things out for themselves, and real legislation regulation that creates societal and broader outcomes that are beneficial, is where we are at right now. Of course, the tricky thing is that, going back to the transparency and opacity, is you don't want to get that balance wrong either. But I do think we're at the stage where we need to experiment, right? We need to figure out what are those optimal levels of transparency, opacity, regulation, and self-regulation.
Now, you also talk about the cold start problem, right? And, Normally, when I think about the cold start problem, I think about it from the platform's perspective. Like, how do you get users when you don't have any users? But you're talking about it from the worker's perspective, right? Where they're
Yeah.
trying to set up shop on these platforms and develop a reputation and get some visibility to potential clients. And of course, the way to do this is you have to start off with low pricing, maybe some free jobs and so forth. And it seems like, I mean, you have to do this in every setting, right? So whether it's slotting allowances in retail or
Yeah.
an internship at a job. Do you think these platforms have steeper or kind of flatter barriers to entry for these workers?
Yeah. So to answer the last question directly, I mean, they generally have lower barriers to entry. Um, as anyone can, at one point, anyone can sign up for an account.
Well, you can sign up for an
Um,
account, but does that mean that you can actually
right. Yeah. That's what
yeah.
that's where I'm moving towards. Yeah. And just for those who are unfamiliar, the cold start in the context now that we're going to talk about, there's this idea that when you're new to a platform, the algorithm, even though you may have experience and skills, they don't have any platform experience or ratings to be able to use to recommend you. Right. So they need you to start using get ratings in order to the algorithm to match you. But the question is, how do you get ratings when there's so many people on the platforms, right? So this is why it's called a cold start, that people don't have any relevant experience or information for the algorithms to match them. And now, what the point that I made is that, yeah, as these platforms have grown, it's very difficult for workers to overcome the cold start because, they have to try to convince people to take a bet or to hire someone that doesn't have any ratings on them. And so what I argue is, or what I show in the book is that workers do all these kind of weird things that I think are not optimal for the platform or the users on there. And let me give you one example. So this is common, right? Like when you start a first job, you'd be willing to, you might be willing to do it for free or for very little. Now, that's common across many settings, not just digital platforms. But one of the things I record in my book is that when workers take a project for a lower wage to try to get their first rating, that wage gets publicly posted on their profile. And so now it's really hard for the workers to ask for a higher rate that is more in line with their actual market value. And so in the book, some workers talked about it took them years to be able to raise their market wage to a comparable level. And so, so that's one feature that is very difficult. And the other one that I discuss in the book.
But to be fair, if you go work for a company and you accept the internship job, they're not going to promote you to VP in like a week,
For sure. Right? Yeah, no doubt about it. But I mean, one, as a worker, you have generally some level of agency whether to report that internship and how much you're going to say they pay or not, right? On your resume or your LinkedIn. Whereas on these platforms, you don't have a choice, right? If you accept it, it's going to be automatically and publicly posted, theoretically forever, right? So it gets to a point that you mentioned earlier. It's true. None of these dynamics are completely new and never experienced. It's just like they're kind of on steroids a little bit, on these platforms and on a global scale. And so the other thing that I talk about is that workers on the platform who have difficulty overcoming the cold start, they're like, one way that we can overcome this is post a ghost job on the platform and have a bunch of people apply for it, and then go through and read their bids and how much are people proposing for their wages. Now that helps a new worker, but for the people applying, it's a lot of wasted time, and for the platform itself, right? It's essentially a scam job or a ghost job, if you want. That I'm revealing that this cold start problem, it creates market inefficiencies for everyone involved.
Right. And so one would think that these platforms would, I mean, if you think about other platforms like music and film platforms, how do they deal with new films or, new pieces of music that don't have any ratings, right? I mean, and so the Spotify will use, right, item-based filtering to supplement the user-based filtering. So, these platforms, you talked about how they would use skills tests to kind of maybe level set your position before you've done any jobs, right? So why haven't those sorts of techniques helped people to kind of get started more quickly? Or why haven't the
Yeah.
platforms invested more in, using, I don't know, pieces of information from outside the platform, like you come in,
Yeah.
you have a computer science PhD and you show up, right? I mean, that should
Yeah.
buy you something, right? When you show up
Yeah.
on the platform.
Yeah. So and just because I think this coastal problem is solvable in the long run, right? Because of what we said, what we're alluding to, that over time there's got to be some way to assess a skill. Either you upload your degree, you take it. But now going to your question directly, so what the platform tried to do, as I said, so especially in the days that I was studying, you could be like, yeah, I've done all these projects. I have my PhD from MIT, Stanford, and Harvard, right? Like, because of the scale, so they had like, at some point, like millions of workers. They didn't at that time have the infrastructure to be able to validate and vet everyone's skills and experience. So they're like, okay, let's
Yeah,
create
yeah.
these
I
skills
think
tests.
like LinkedIn, I think in the early days also you could put, whatever degree you wanted, and now
Yeah,
they they have some process for
right.
filtering that.
Exactly. But so the problem with the skills test that people develop is that, one, employers, they didn't really understand what it meant, right? Like, let's say you're like, oh, you have even now, like, um, let's say you have a badge from, I don't know, like, I don't want to put anyone's name out there, but let's say you have a badge from some smaller university, community college. Employers generally struggle to understand what that means, right? Or they'll pass over it. They'll look for more recognizable, established credentials and proxies for skills. And so, at least when I was studying, many of the workers, employers, are like, yeah, like we tried, but it didn't help us because employers didn't know what it meant or how the passing of that skills test would concretely help them do the job that they required. So the short answer is that it's possible it could work over time as people gain more familiarity, right? There was a time when people didn't know what Stanford was or Berkeley was. But over time, gaining status, reputation, not everyone, right? So as I said, I'm more optimistic that this cold start problem can be resolved, as there are mechanisms to assess skills and expertise other than like actually getting ratings on the platform.
Yeah, and it would seem like if you start to become more careful about job descriptions, right? As jobs become more, codified, you start to develop, like I know I bought a car recently on this platform called Bring a Trailer, and all they do is cars, right? So
Mm,
eBay pretty much, if you go and buy a car on eBay, you don't know what you're getting. You go to this place, I mean, they have a protocol for detailing all of the
nice.
relevant features that you would be looking for in a car, like mileage and
Yeah.
repair history, and you can go to Carfax and all that stuff. And so if you're just doing, like, I don't know, full stack developers, then maybe you can start to get at what the qualifications might be that would
Yeah. So,
predict quality.
sorry if I cut you off. But in irony of what I believe I document this in the book is that towards the end, the way they tried to do this was they released this like thing called hand-picked
Oh
freelancers,
yeah, right.
right? Where it's like going back to where they started.
Yeah.
It's like, okay, we will individually, because it's so hard and there are workers from all over the world. Like, you know what? We will individually vet them and kind of put them in this specialized pool. So again, because labor is different than a car or product or other things like that. Even now, like, I teach MBA students, undergrads as well. Hiring from Northwestern or all these other schools, it's not easy. It's not, like, employers spend a lot of time even though they're coming out with these degrees and from these very reputable institutions, they still, it's not like, okay, you have it, there you go, here's your, I mean, maybe some, but usually that's not the case, right? um so right, I mean, again, I think what we're getting at is some sort of mechanism or method that's not just algorithmic based, that can be bias, game, so on and so forth, but some way to, or multiple ways, how about that? Multiple ways to try to assess people's skills, expertise, to be able to match them more efficiently over time.
Yeah, and I was wondering the whole time. I mean, wonder why these platforms did not create sort of a, I don't know, a user association or user group, right? So, if you look at a lot of the big software companies like Salesforce and so forth, I mean, they have encouraged the formation of these user groups so that they can kind of consult with them and say, hey, like, what are some of your
Hmm.
concerns? Like, what are
Hmm.
what's going on here? I mean, is there any evidence that they are following these blogs and these chats and trying to find out like where the dissatisfaction is and addressing it in that way,
Yeah.
or do you need to have some more formal channels like SAP and Oracle and all those folks have with their users?
Yeah. So so yes, I believe that there was that they did attempt and continue to do so, but at least from what we could see and what Worker said, it was unclear whether they were actually following that. And again, there can be multiple reasons, right? Like, again, when a lot of these organizations are trying to scale and grow really fast, it's hard to sit down and slow down and be like, okay, we have this data from our user UX team. Now, what do we actually do with it? How do we translate it when you're just, trying to scale and grow? So to your point, my prediction would be that, like with these other very mature companies, they will develop more sophisticated, formalized ways to get a better pulse on users. And again, going to your point, like, I actually think they did a much better job with employers because they're the ones who are paying,
Yeah.
right? So they, like incorporating their feedback and features. But I would hope, I mean, going to your question, I kind of go back and forth. Like, if you ask Amazon sellers, I don't think they would say Amazon has listened to them very much. Right? I don't know. I might be wrong, but my general sense is that even though they have like feedback and so on and so forth, they still kind of prioritize growth in customers rather than the sellers, right? Because there's just so many of them. So I hope that they get to more formalized, established pathways and mechanisms to incorporate user feedbacks, but the jury's still out to see whether that is going to actually happen.
Well, I mean, it's easy for us to forget that, we're still in the very early days of these businesses. I mean, by the time Frederick Taylor showed up at the, at the factory, that these factories were already, 20, 30 years old, right?
Yeah.
We've only been doing this for a while. So it's, in some sense, you're studying a work in progress. And I was wondering if you could talk just a bit now about your research methodology, because I think most of my colleagues in business school, the way they approach these things is in partnership with these companies, right? So I have
Yeah.
colleagues that have worked with eBay, I have colleagues that work with Amazon, and they,
Yeah.
they go under the hood and they see what's going on and then report out. You didn't do that, but you did join the platform and play around with it as a worker and a client. So maybe talk a bit about this research methodology. And it's fundamentally it's sociology, right? I mean,
Yeah.
you're doing field work.
That's right.
So
Yeah. No, it's a great question. And so, let me say, broadly speaking, every method has pros and cons. I think that's really important to recognize, because sometimes you're like, many scholars or people, you just know one method and you're like, this is kind of the best. But, what you're saying is that working with the company and doing more kind of quantitative analysis is really good for measuring like specific interventions and outcomes. I mean, other things too, but it doesn't get it's not able to get as much fine grain about the day-to-day experiences of people who are using it. And the reason I did not partner with the platform is, one, very practical. When I interviewed and spoke to workers, that was one of the first questions they asked. What is your relationship with the platform? And I realized early on, I needed to say, like, I don't have a formal relationship with them so that they can open up and tell me, right? Like, again, when your boss asks you how things are going, compared to, when you're talking with your friends and family, how, the same question, the response is very different, right? Like that's just the way it is. Like it's just, when somebody has power to over, your livelihood or your experiences or your performance, it does influence the way you see the world, the way you respond. And so that was one decision I made early on. And then the second one was to try to follow this longitudinally, to try to get at how things are changing, not just in the short term, but over time. That's why I ended up using 6 years of data for this book, right? And just as an aside, it turned out that many of these platform companies, again, I can never speak to intent. No one can ever speak to someone's intention, but they provided biased data to researchers. And it's led to sometimes retractions. It's led to, editors' notes being added onto these articles saying that, the data that the researchers received or got wasn't actually the raw data that would be used, right? And so that was another reason why, again, ultimately, it's not either or. We need multiple methods to try to get a sense for, what are the pros and cons? How do things change over time? Questions about different data, like generally fieldwork is really adept at answering questions about how do things unfold, processes, motivations, whereas more kind of traditional quantitative work is much better at understanding, cause and effect, right? But if you find a relationship between even a quote unquote causal relationship, it still leaves a lot of questions about how is it measured, what was going on when people were answering the survey or were responding to this intervention. So yes, I tried to look at this through a fieldwork ethnographic qualitative approach, and it yielded again this very rich account, which frankly the platform reached out to me several times after my study, like, wow, like we knew about this, but we didn't realize the extent to which some of these problems or issues are there, and we'd love to collaborate and so on and so forth, right? So it's somewhat of validation that very careful, patient, long-term fieldwork can yield insights that are often missed when you just use one or similar types of approaches.
Yeah, I was going to ask you about the extent to which the company was interested in this, because it seems like information that companies like this should want to know, right? I mean, knowing this can help them in tremendous ways, but a lot of companies will sort of put their head in the sand and be oblivious. So how can a company kind of foster this kind of informative research without right, corrupting or impeding,
or waiting for the regulation, right?
or making it impossible for the researcher to actually do the research.
Yeah, that's a very, very good, important question. And the reason is because I don't think a lot of these organizations or platforms have figured it out, right? Like, again, if a problem that a lot of us have smartphones, right? You look at the iPhone 16 to iPhone 15. What's the difference, right? It's really hard to tell, right? Like, the reason I'm just using an example, it's like a lot of organizations struggle to like innovate, improve in ways that are like in breakthrough ways, right? I mean, there are many terms that people have talked about this. So the reason I preface this is I don't think the traditional methods of like user groups. I honestly think like we need to have more crowdsourced accountability in external, quote unquote, more objective ways to kind of shake that up. And again, let me give you a very concrete example, right? In the United States, in the bureaucracy time, Consumer Reports, for those who are not aware, Consumer Reports, they had a very outsized influence on how many industries were shaped over the long run towards prioritizing safety. I would argue the organizations themselves were not able to do that through talking to users, doing user. They needed this independent group that was solely focused on customer safety and customer benefits.
But they took no money from the company. So
exactly,
they were lucky that the consumers themselves were willing to pay for the creation of these public goods.
Exactly. Yes, yeah. And so I'm more optimistic of those types. I call it like third-party accountability, crowdsource, ratings. So and there are. So I in the book I talk a little bit about fair work. It's FAIR.work. It's a partnership with many universities, organizations, workers who are trying to come up with, by different countries, ratings on like fairness, transparency. Now, again, we'll have to see, but I'm more optimistic about whatever the equivalent of Consumer Reports is for digital platforms, so on and so forth. I'm more optimistic about something like that
What could be
than the
like a glass
organizations
door,
figuring this
right?
out.
So you could have
What was that?
a glass door type.
Yeah, exactly. So if for those who are looking for projects or looking for what's next, I think that it can come to certifications, right? Like, I don't know if you've been to these new buildings, right? It's like LEED certification. That's not the organization or the building. That's some third party came up with the certificate that now these organizations are trying to get for legitimacy and status, right? And so still, like, even not to veer too off topic here, but car companies, they talk about like, oh, Consumer Reports, we ranked number one, right? It took time for them, but they do value them. If these third party kind of accountability systems gain traction and gain influence and legitimacy, but meaning that people will use them to make decisions about what they buy, what they use, who they hire, so on and so forth.
And what about the role of academics? I mean, it seems like, for instance, in the medical space, right? There's medical research that's not funded necessarily by pharmaceutical industry and so forth that
Yeah.
go and test the efficacy of various protocols and so forth. I mean, is that something that we in business academia should be devoting resources to?
Well, I think the awareness has gotten much higher that we need to have as much as possible independent assessments, right? Like, uh, again, not to be off topic, but when I was a PhD student or student, like, we kind of chuckle, be like, the Chevron funded Institute for Sustainability. Like,
Yeah.
what? How's that? Like, what? Doesn't make any sense. Like, how can an oil company invest in sustainability like that like for true solutions that decrease reliance on oil and carbon, right? Like, so similar types of things. I think in order, I think academics, what drew me into academia and what draws a lot of people in academia is to try to do cutting edge research that is in service of quote unquote objectivity or outcomes that are not tied to the next quarterly earnings or so on and so forth. Yeah. So I do think, and I hope, and my work and others can be leading in that area.
Well, Hatim, thanks so much for joining me. The book is called Inside the Invisible Cage: How Algorithms Control Workers. Check it out.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate the questions.
Unsiloed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.